having today. This is the event session, and we have three interesting speakers who are going to talk to us about creative events and performances in relation to topics of sustainability, heritage, and accessibility. We have Briony from the University of Cardiff, Emily Godden, and Jack Hardiker. As with all of the other Meet the Researcher sessions, what we're going to do is run this as three separate presentations. They'll each run to about 10 minutes, and then we'll have about 5 minutes for Q&A after each. Unfortunately, our fourth speaker, Lora Markova, is unwell and will be unable to join us. So there will be some extra time at the end of each of the sessions and at the end of the overall session for any if we get into some interesting discussion in the Q&A. So right, without further ado, just to say, as with all of these, please post your questions and questions to the speakers in the Q&A tab, making sure that they're directed at the Q&A tab in this session rather than the entire event, so that we don't miss them. Yeah, okay. So first of all, we have Briony, who is a PhD researcher at the Centre for Climate Change and Social Transformations, CAST, at Cardiff University, and we'll be talking about her work looking at the impact of cultural events. Okay. Welcome, Briony.
Great. So thanks everyone for having me here today. I'm here to talk about a research project about whether cultural events can catalyse engagement with climate change. So me and another researcher used a programme called Season for Change to explore this question. So Season for Change was a UK-wide programme of arts and culture led by the organisations Arts Admin and Julie's Bicycle. And really it had the goal of responding to and also inspiring action on climate change. So this lasted about 18 months and it was in the run-up to COP26 last year, which was the United Nations climate change conference that was held in Glasgow. So the Season for Change team commissioned me and Adam Corner to write the report. Adam is a writer and researcher who specialises in climate change communication and culture and climate collaborations. And my background is originally in the creative industry, mainly in photography and retouching, before moving into communications and then public engagement with climate change. So the Season for Change programme covered a huge amount of stuff from poetry, theatre, radio, workshops, installations, a really broad range of art forms and activities, as well as different topics and varying addressed climate change in a lot of variety of different ways. And it particularly focused on centering communities and groups that have been underrepresented in and excluded from the climate change conversation, such as people of colour, disabled people, or working class people. And although there was a huge amount to choose from, we really drilled down and focused on three specific projects. So I'll just go through each of these in a little bit of detail now. First one we looked at was called Roma Recycle, Reuse, Reimagine. And this was a project working with organisations across the UK and Roma families across the UK and Europe to explore issues of recycling, human rights and climate justice. They had a variety of outputs from that project, ranging from books and films to workshops and training sessions as well. Second project we looked at was called CC's Speakeasy. So this was an immersive spoken word experience set in 2031 that imagined a future where coffee and chocolate production were so severely impacted by climate change that CC's Speakeasy was the only place to get them. And then we also looked at The Space Between, which was a project with 4 artists whose individual projects sought to embody the principles of connecting art and local communities to considerations of global and local justice, as well as environmental and social issues more locally. So me and Adam attended some of the events from these projects. We also interviewed artists and organisers from them, as well as interviewing the programme manager for Season for Change as a whole. So what we were really looking to do with this work was to give a bit of a social science perspective on how arts and cultural events seek to build a public engagement with climate change. And as this quote from our report illustrates, what we were looking at was to see whether the projects embody or represent principles of effective public engagement around climate change, but also do those social and psychological concepts that underpin good public engagement with climate change actually make sense in a more creative and cultural context. So what we did at the start of the report was highlighted some key things about what we know about good public engagement with climate change. So I'll just run through these briefly now. So in terms of diverse audiences, we know there's not a homogenous public to engage with. What works for one group might not work for another. And it's also really important to have a strong social mandate or buy-in from a wide range of people to bring about action on climate change. So having a clear understanding of who your audience is can really help to make climate change more relevant and engaging. Also, diverse messengers. So who communicates about climate change is a key factor in public engagement. For example, people in Britain view certain professions as trustworthy. Typically, people like doctors, teachers are quite high up on the list, but also professors, scientists, museum curators. So when engaging with specific audiences, it's important to think about that, but also whether there are more appropriate people to communicate this issue. For example, are there people who are particularly trusted in their local community or particularly trusted by specific demographics? Also, values and worldviews. So what underpins people's attitudes and responses are really important. And knowing where people's values differ or where they're common and can bring people together can be really helpful. Emotions can also drive engagement. So whether that's fear, hope, anger, humour, optimism, and negative emotions aren't necessarily bad, but having a sense of efficacy and agency, so people being able to believe that what they do matters, is really critical and they feel like they can make a difference. In terms of local and global, the language used to describe climate change and the way it's framed can emphasise particular aspects as well. So talking about it as an emergency, or whether you talk about it as local or global, positions the subject in quite different ways, none of which are necessarily wrong, but just being aware that it might work for different people. And then last but not least, dialogue and two-way communication is really important. So for people to be able to learn, feel involved and engaged, so it's not just a one-way flow of factual information. So in terms of what we found from our research, there were some really positive examples of climate change engagement principles that were embodied in the Season for Change programme. So across the projects that we looked at, there was a common sense of focusing on agency and efficacy, so nurturing the sense that the actions we take matter. Also, where projects were able to quite clearly make a link between the artworks that they created and sustainable use of materials. For example, this happened in the Space Between project. The kind of practical message, for example, of avoiding waste is really likely to have landed well with a range of audiences, as that's something that kind of resonates across Britain. Also, some climate change issues and broader sustainability issues that were addressed were made very tangible. So, for example, in CC Speakeasy, looking at coffee and chocolate, and some issues were quite rooted in a sense of place as well. And it was good that Season for Change appeared to have centred people of colour, emerging artists, communities and audiences who might not typically be involved in climate change related issues. And it's really important, as I said, for everyone to be involved in the climate change conversation. But the project also provided an opportunity for those who were involved to learn about and engage with climate change. So it wasn't solely an engagement opportunity for the audiences, it was an opportunity for the artists and organisers as well. And the projects were quite varied in terms of the impact that they aimed to have on their audiences. And that really kind of reflected the spectrum of art as a kind of primarily creative outlet to art as potential activism as well. And the extent to which the projects had an explicit connection to climate change also varied quite a lot. So some were a bit more subtle. So while the relevance of climate change may have been clear in the artists and producers' minds involved in Season for Change, it is possible that the link to climate change might have been less obvious in some of the projects to some audiences. But there's no single kind of prescriptive way for cultural events to catalyse engagement with climate change. There's no right way for it to work. but we did feel that in some cases the projects could have been more explicit about climate change without compromising the integrity of the art. And alternatively, or in addition to, cultural events can be used as a stimulus for further discussion and incorporate more structured climate conversation opportunities alongside them. So being able to design climate conversations into cultural events and also structuring them based on those kind of good principles of public engagement that underpin positive engagement with climate change can really offer a potential to kind of maximise on those strengths of culture and climate communication. So that's just a very quick run through of the key points from the report. If you want to read the full report, you can scan the QR code and that'll take you to the research page of my website. And it's the first item under projects and publications. I'd really encourage you to take a look. There's loads of really interesting content that I haven't had time to go through, interesting quotes from artists and producers that we interviewed about how they kind of tackled climate change and what they were aiming to achieve with their work. So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you for that, Briony. That was really interesting. We haven't got any questions yet from the audience. I think people are maybe still on their second cup of coffee and still coming to the day. But correct me if I'm wrong, but from what you said, it sounded like you were talking about the your findings from the practitioners, from the cultural practitioners. Did you do any work with the audiences on how they felt?
So not for this project, no. So this report sort of slotted in to complement a wider report that the Season for Change team did. And I believe they did a lot of audience research. But for ours, it was just sort of a smaller case study to complement that. So yeah, that's definitely something that we would have liked to do had we had more time and ability to. But essentially we were kind of looking from the artists and practitioners side and kind of mapping that onto what we already know from social science and psychological literature around public engagement. But yeah, it would have been really interesting to look at those 3 projects and be able to specifically ask audience members about it. But yeah, something to do in future for sure.
Brilliant. Yeah, well, talking about future, I've just seen a question from Emily in the chat asking what are the next steps for the report and for your wider research.
Yeah, thanks for the question, Emily. So we don't have specific follow-up project from the report, but yeah, it seemed to be received really well. People were interested in it. So yeah, I think there's definitely space. There's already kind of research going on in this area, but there's definitely space to do more.
Lovely. We've also got a question from Paul Grandin, who's asking, are you working on other cultural events with climate change? Oh, sorry. Are you working on other cultural events with climate change built in at present? I'm not quite sure. Built in at, oh, okay. Are you working with other cultural events with climate change built in at the present time? Thanks,
sort
Paul.
of. So slightly different to this work, but I'm currently doing another project with Adam, the same researcher who I did this with, looking at audience travel to live music events. So we're hoping to have a report out on that next month. So we've been working with music festivals and live events on that. So yeah, slightly different, but yeah, there'll be more work out on that soon.
Okay. We're talking about other projects. I mean, I'd be interested to hear a little bit more about some of the 3 projects that you looked at this time. I know that, you know, today our time was initially limited, but we've got a little bit more time than expected with Laura's absence. So if there were any interesting points about each of those projects, I'd be keen to hear that.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, they were all really interesting to talk to people about and go and watch the events. But I think for me, there was a lot of particularly interesting stuff that came out of CC's Speakeasy. So we spoke to a couple of the poets from that, and we also spoke to the show's producer, and just getting a sense of really what they wanted to try and achieve with it. So the producer was saying that when the kind of idea of looking at climate change impacts on coffee and chocolate came up. She said, why have I never heard of that before? That's really tangible. Why aren't people talking about that? So it goes back to that point of making climate change tangible for people, something that people can connect to, that they really wanted to build on. And then speaking to the artists as well, they were kind of very aware of what they were trying to do with the audience. So one of them had quite like a joyful, funny poem, and said that they deliberately made an attempt to refrain from telling the audience that, like, this is exactly what you need to do about climate change. This is the problem. It's really serious, because they didn't want to be too serious or kind of concerned about the issue and end up blaming the audience. So trying to get some kind of call to action without being too direct about it. But yeah, and it goes back to the point about asking the audience as well, whether that intention from the poets and the artists kind of actually fed through to reality and how the audience reacted to that.
Lovely. Well, thank you so much for that, Briony. Really interesting work. And maybe if anybody has any other questions, Briony will be available throughout the day through the people directory here at Hopin. So just find her on the search tool and get in touch with a direct message or invite her to a video chat.
Yeah, of course.
Okay.
Thanks.
Thank you very much, Briony. Next we have Next we have Emily Godden. Emily is a PhD student with the Story Lab Research Institute and a BA Hons Digital Media Production Lecturer at Anglia Ruskin University in Cambridge. She's going to be talking to us about the role of interactive storytelling in environmental heritage. Okay, Emily. Welcome. I thought I dropped you in the ether. Okay, welcome, and I'll leave you to it.
Hello, hopefully you can see the slides all okay. Awesome. So I'm going to be talking to you about a small section of my PhD research. The poster of this talk and title is Rebuilding a Ruin, Greyfriars the Ghost in the Machine. So before we get into it, I'll tell you a bit about what Greyfriars is, where it's situated, to give you some context. So this research explores the story of Dunwich. Dunwich is a small coastal village on the edge, and I mean the edge of East Suffolk, and it's commonly referred to as Britain's Atlantis. This is because most of it is underwater. To the right on this image I have here, this is a papier-mâché model. I know you're probably seeing lots of really high-tech, busy technology, but we're taking it low-tech here for a bit of papier-mâché temporarily. This is in the Dunwich Museum, so if you ever find yourself in Dunwich, I do recommend having a look at the museum. And in this diagram, you'll see a dotted yellow line. This model was built in about the 80s, 90s. Everything south of this line is underwater. So in about the 13th, 14th century, Dunwich was second to only London. Just to give you an idea of its trade and income, it relied a lot on its coastal ports to bring in a lot of that trade. Now a lot of that is pretty much all of Dunwich is underwater. There's a very small fraction of it left, and only circa 100 humans inhabit Dunwich. So we've lost about a dozen churches, hospitals, prisons, market square, ports, you name it, it's gone. So this research explores a series of practice-led online open access interactive storytelling outcomes which archive the lost and vulnerable environmental heritage before it's completely gone in its totality. And spoilers, it's disappearing roughly at a rate of 1 metre per year, pending any particularly spicy storms that might come and take a big chunk out of it. So situating this within my wider PhD research, my working title, so for context, I'm a part-time PhD student and I'm about halfway through this adventure, is Spectres, Storytelling and Seabold, Can Interactive Narrative-Driven Virtual Heritage Rebuild the Lost City of Dunwich? Answers on a postcard, greatly appreciated. I've got this diagram on the right. It came out of reading the text Ikigai, which is about finding your true meaning, purpose and happiness. And in their diagram, what's in the middle is your true happiness and contentment. So why wouldn't a PhD be slap bang in the middle? I've got the wider themes, video games, immersive storytelling, e-waste, environmental heritage, that then begin to focus in on topics as we get closer to the middle, such as zombie media, media archaeology, virtual heritage, interactive narratives. So I'm interested in the power that stories have to communicate the virtual heritage of Dunwich, and this image on the right is showing the 3D model in development of Greyfriars itself. So enable it to survive virtually before it's completely gone. And I'm sharing this quote with you from Janet Murray from the text Hamlet on the Holodeck. It's a really, really, really good read. I do recommend it. This particular quote stood out. It's the storyteller and audience operate in a multimodal space, as digital narratives offer us the opportunity to enact stories rather than to merely witness them. And I think that quote's particularly powerful because we're online right now, we're quite used to maybe being a bit passive, not fully present, we're multitasking, trying to juggle lots of roles and responsibilities in our life. And this idea of going beyond just a witness to truly embody and operate in this multimodal space is particularly exciting, I believe. So this is Greyfriars, what remains of Greyfriars, and it has a particularly interesting history. So its initial purpose was as a medieval friary. It then went on to have numerous uses and changed hands a few times. It then went on to become a town hall. It then became a prison. And eventually it had a strange castle-like extension on it. The reason being this was on the coast, and the owner wanted to make it look like they owned a really massive castle, and then behind it was Greyfriars. That extension, the new owners removed that extension because it was ugly. I'm not an architect. The new owners believed it was ugly, and this is now talking circa Victorian period. They deliberately left it to ruin because that was the trend of the time. And this image shows what remains of Greyfriars. You can walk up to it. There's fields either side, so sheep probably see it most than humans. So it also has quite a few ghost stories attached to this site, hence why I have a floating ghost here called Agnes, from choral singing being heard, dating back to the monks, through to an Elizabethan ghost called, who I've named Agnes. They don't actually have a name. They're dressed in Elizabethan typical dress, and they can be seen frequenting the coast cliff edge. And the story goes they were sleeping in their beds one night, and a particularly bad storm took their house and them into the sea. So you may see a floating lantern heading out to sea, and that if you see that, whether you believe in ghosts or not, I challenge anyone to be there at night and sort of feel that presence. There's definitely something going on there. So I'm interested in how avatars can give meaning to our behaviours and actions. This quote here, paraphrased from Calais and Marx, and in particular how that meaning that they're referring to and how it gives meaning to our actions and behaviours, how that can be extended to a virtual heritage environment of Greyfriars, and what that impact of being present with other avatars are on that virtual heritage environment. So the aims of this research are to move beyond a simple reconstruction, not that the processes are simple, but to move beyond just a reconstruction of a place to develop a virtual space to be inhabited remotely by the player as an avatar. I think it's quite important, this idea of being an avatar rather than a floating webcam. It changes our actions and our behaviours, sometimes for good, sometimes not so for good. It's an area that I want to explore further, and how the impact of a multiplayer virtual experience changes how the heritage is communicated, experienced, and what learning can come from that. And this is where the research into multiplayer online open world video game spaces is particularly important learning for this research. All of this, I'm keen for it to live in the web browser, because a lot of virtual immersive VR, AR, MR, all the R's, they rely on quite expensive hardware, which contributes to a lot of e-waste. And I'm keen that this research is sustainable as possible, so that it can live on as long as possible, given that there's, to paraphrase Eric Champion, that virtual heritage needs to outlive the actual heritage it's depicting. And this is what I'm trying to do. Although Dunwich is disappearing quite quickly, I still want to outlive Dunwich, although I hope it lives on forever. So I shared some work at Beyond Conference a few years ago, which was a homebrew LiDAR scanning device, and that shows where I started in lockdown, and the image shown on the right shows where I'm at now. My methodology comes from Sarah Pink and their ideas around digital ethnography, And to paraphrase, they invite researchers to consider how we live and research in a digital, material and sensory environment. And they go on to state that in digital ethnography, we're often in a mediated contact with participants rather than in direct presence. I think this is quite powerful because you could be at the physical site. Very few humans could actually physically get there for whichever reason. But it would be much more easier to share the virtual heritage because you'd have suddenly a global audience. But what is that impact of being in a mediated rather than an actual presence is something that I'm particularly keen to explore. And if anyone has any ideas around that, I'd love to hear your thoughts. So some background on virtual heritage. This is an earlier definition from Robert Stone and Educator. And virtual heritage, they describe as the use of computer-based interactive technologies to record, preserve, or recreate artifacts, sites, and actors of historic, artistic, religious, and cultural significance to deliver the results openly to a global audience in such a way as to provide formative educational experiences through electronic manipulations of time and space. So there's this idea that it's for purposes of recording and preservation. There's an idea around accuracy that they're alluding to, whereas a more recent definition from Eric Champion argues that virtual heritage is the attempt to convey not just the appearance, but also the meaning and significance of cultural artifacts and the associated social agency that designed and used them with interactive and immersive digital media. There's lots of different virtual heritage definitions growing out there, but I think this one's particularly exciting because of the ideas around social agency and the idea that you could have agency in a virtual space and how that could change your attitudes and behaviours towards environmental heritage. These images on the right are archival images of what Dunwich used to look like, and on the right is showing it from the Victorian period where it started to fall into ruin. I hope I haven't just spoken at terms and conditions speed. That's the end of my talk. Thank you for listening and to be on for this opportunity to share my research. Do get in touch either through the conference or my email there. I'm going to stop sharing the screen and welcome any questions.
Thank you so much for that. Thank you so much for that, Emily. That was really interesting. As a child who grew up in East Anglia and went on school trips to Dunwich, I can attest to the slightly spooky nature of that. I've still got probably some of my sketches and models that I made as a 9-year-old, hearing about the bell that tolled under the sea in the night and the voices of lost people. So thank you. That was really interesting to hear more about that. But just you've talked about that site. How would your work apply to other heritage sites? Would it impact on your methodology or your expectations? I'd be interested to hear a little bit about that.
Thank you. That's a good question. So, although this is site-specific research to Dunwich, I envisage that the methods wouldn't change. I think there should be a move towards more sustainable methods of creating virtual heritage. This space consumes a vast amount of energy and hardware and complicated and difficult to use software. So developing a workflow that relies more on open source software and building workflows that multiple places could use, museums, everyday humans could use to develop their own experiences. I think it's particularly exciting to enable humans to go from consumers to producers of their own content and use what they likely have in their pocket, their smartphone. It just gives so much more agency to the audience to create their own environments, which I think would be really interesting. And Dunwich isn't unique. Unfortunately, lots of coastal communities, and for other reasons, not just coastal erosion, rising sea levels, climate crisis, and it's nice to follow on from Briony's talk. It is only becoming an increasing issue, how you protect heritage due to climate crisis.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, we had a question there from Shelley, although it seems to have just disappeared. Sorry, Shelley, do you want to repost that if something's gone wrong? Do you think this will provoke a more? I guess I think that's. Do you think this will provoke a more engaged worldview in people? I'm assuming that was engaged, Shelley. let me know if I've misinterpreted.
I think giving humans that agency to have control in the space will enable them to find and identify stories that are important to them within the heritage, and not just let the archive gatekeepers or the producers, developers. New stories could be developed within that space that have nothing to do with dunnage, but it's about bringing people in that place to learn about it and to create their own stories. And I think that's really powerful. And we've seen that happen in lots of particularly video game ludic spaces like Minecraft, and how can continue this in develop experiences for the web browser.
Yeah. I mean, although the process of dunnage was a slow, a gradual impact, we are seeing, if you look at all the floods in across the east, the Middle East, Far East, this year, and also in the States, there's a lot that we can build out from this into engaging materials to engage other communities. Okay, thank you for that. If there aren't any questions, I'll just check the chat section again, just in case I missed one. Okay, if there aren't any more questions, I'll let Emily come off stage and I'll introduce our next speaker. Yes, thank you. As Emily said, she'll be around for the rest of the day so find her through the people directory. And yeah, we'll take the sorry. Okay, please let me welcome Jack Hardiker to the stage. He's an artist, researcher, educator at the Royal College of Art, and he's going to talk about creating a sense of presence in physical spaces. Welcome, Jack.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, can hear you beautifully. I'll leave you to it.
Thank you very much. Right, I will share my screen. So I'm going to be blind once I start sharing my screen. So save your, I'll see any comments or questions at the end. Okay, hopefully you can just see a big black screen with some words on it. So yes, as Tom said, I'm from the Royal College of Art. I'm a tutor on the digital direction course in the School of Communication. I also run my own collaborative studio called Office of Everyone. So Office of Everyone, like I say, it's a collaborative studio, and we're working to increase access and participation across the arts and culture using storytelling technology. So much of our recent work has been involved with the fields of performance and theatre. So I'm going to talk a bit about that today. But just on the course digital direction, so I'm a tutor researcher on digital direction, which is in the School of Communication, the Royal College of Art in London. So our programme addresses the urgent need for inclusive storytelling and examines the emergence of contemporary story technologies, but also the future of storytelling itself. I lead a storytelling community called Storytelling for the Unexpected, which in the community, I encourage my students to incorporate accessibility and participation into the foundation of every project they do. So yesterday, I should say, yeah, I've had a brilliant time at Beyond, met so many incredible people. And yesterday there was an accessibility talk, Christine Hemphill from Open Inclusion. She presented a brilliant quote, which I think is pretty perfect, which is disability in technology is where design has failed us, which I got home yesterday and told my partner this, and it took both of us a minute to let it kind of click around our heads, but I just think it's an absolutely wonderful quote. So today I'm going to be talking about a practice-based research project called Through the Cracks. First, I'm going to show you a couple of funny oddities, little projects that I've done over the years that have led to this project. So I'll start with a project called Movements. So actually we're going all the way back to 2014 here, and this was my first degree final project. So you know, it came up in Emily's talk a bit. So we spend, you know, tons of time in front of screens, which is, it's quite ironic I'm saying this as we all talking to one another via screens right now, but much of our time is spent on these devices, phones, computers, in sedentary isolation. So back in 2014, as an antidote to this, I developed a local, I'll come back to that word in a second, local multiplayer game that encouraged physical collaborative play, which had spatial multi-channel audio by the electronic artist Efterklang. So Movements was an app, and it was to facilitate playful collaboration by transforming a group of people in one location, so that word local, into musicians in an orchestra. So essentially they logged in a room together, and in the same space they performed specific movements, and those movements determined whether music, orchestral music, would stay in time and on key, but also affected the volume. So effectively the student, here we see some children playing with the app. Not right now, in a second you'll see some children playing with the app. This was just some children playing, and here we go. And their movements determine the volume of the sound as well, so effectively they could remix this orchestral music live by movements that they did. Another project, skipping forward to lockdown. So I found myself again exploring this idea of phones or devices collaborating, network phones and devices collaborating. So this was part of a wider research project which included video installations for the gallery, the home, classroom and office. But this project told the cautionary tale of hummingbird classification and AI. We don't have time to dig into hummingbird classification and AI right now, so I'll leave that there. But if I play the video, this was created during lockdown, and I, like many, craved the sensation of experiencing physical art. I particularly love multi-channel sound and video work, and I create multi-channel sound and video work. So here you see 5 phones, 5 devices that are collaborating to present one piece of work that moves between the phones. This was a multi-channel sound piece as well, so each phone had a unique piece of work coming through it. If anyone can see me on the tiny screen, this big thing you see in the background was a gallery version of the project. So we've got 4 boxes there, each had a screen inset and a speaker inset. And now it's in permanent storage in my office until I can find somewhere to show it again. So I think in this project, I started to dig into this idea of creating presence, or the aura of physical work, but remotely in people's homes. And here's a quick video of some students at Falmouth School of Art. I got them to do some user testing for me. And here you see that they're holding the phones out in front of them, and they're watching this piece play out in front of them across the devices. I'll let it go from one screen to the next, and then we'll move on. Oh yeah, here we go. So yes, the students were, thankfully, they really enjoyed it and gave some wonderful feedback. So now I'm going to dig into what I'm here to talk about. So Through the Cracks is an augmented reality theatre project that I've been developing with Richard Twyman at the English Touring Theatre. So we're in very early stages, I should add. So, I think Emily and Briony presented just some incredible work there. I think this is probably a little earlier stage than where they're up to. So I'll just read a little. So AR traditionally involves adding to or embellishing objects, people and spaces. However, these embellishments exist within established, often discriminatory social structures of our physical world. Conversely, Through the Cracks employs AR to create new extended spaces for storytelling and expression. So this unconventional interpretation of AR is not a virtual space fully detached from the physical world. It's a liminal space between spaces that can be used to communicate undervalued or overlooked stories. So the title Through the Cracks refers both to the method of experiencing the piece, which I'll show you in a minute, but also the metaphor of stories that have slipped through the cracks. So while Through the Cracks seeks to address established structures using technology, I do remain mindful of the imperialistic systems that underpin technology's development. So this is a quote from Philip Auslander. So what degree of technological mediation is permissible before a performance ceases to be live? So Philip Auslander's big inspiration for me. And yeah, his book Liveness, Performance in a Mediatized Culture from 1999, I highly recommend people have a read of that. But for me, this is a really interesting question when we talk about creating theatre or creating the feeling of live performance using technology. Because yeah, what amount of mediation is acceptable for something to still be live feeling? So through the cracks, using their phone, the audience using their phone or a tablet, they'll see a virtual chasm appear in the floor beneath them. Through this fault line, they watch a story unfold performed by real humans. The illusion of three-dimensionality is created using a technique that I developed specifically for this project that allows us to use recordings of the real actors' faces rather than virtual reproduction. So for me, you know, actors have incredible faces. When I go to the theatre, I'm focusing in on these beautiful facial expressions. So for me, volumetric capture is absolutely incredible, but sometimes it can be a little uncanny and you can't get that beautiful detail that you get from an actor's face. So it's really important for me that we brought the real actor's facial expressions into this. So the story is viewed from overhead. So the performance appears to happen beneath you. And this method of presenting stories does have more of a quality of kind of an intimate performance than linear recorded media, which it is. So for example, when the actor looks up at you or up at the, you know, the user, it really does feel like they're looking into your eyes. So that breaking of the fourth wall is kind of more affecting than the breaking of the fourth wall that you'd be watching in standard video. It really does feel like they're calling up to you. So the first prototype that we created, we worked with British Nigerian playwright Dipo Barawa Eti. So the piece follows two West African protagonists on a perilous journey to England. And at moments in the piece, the actors do actually call to you as a user and speak directly to you. And it really is quite kind of, heartbreaking to do the narrative. So in addressing the typical barriers to accessing theatre, so barriers such as age, geography, socioeconomic and disability status, we simultaneously explore how innovation in live performance can mitigate the art form's environmental impact. So this new digital form reduces many of the carbon intensive aspects of traditional theatre, such as stage, lighting, scenic fabrication, transport. You know, when you build a set, you build it often out of MDF. It creates a lot of waste. So all of that said, I don't see this work as being a replacement for physical live performance. For me, I see it as a gateway to further exploration for people. But, you know, equally, there are places in the UK or places around the world where theatre is very difficult to access. And so I don't want to leave those people behind. I want them to be able to experience, you know, the beauty of theatre, but from a small town where they don't have access to a major city, or not easy access to a major city. So here's a little clip, very, very short clip of the experience, but you can see here the actors are underground. So this is just a screen record from the app working. So there, I'm only giving a tiny bit away for now. So thinking about what's next. So another Philip Orslander quote, is liveness primarily an effective experience on the part of the audience rather than a characteristic of the performance? A performance is live to the extent that we experience them that way as an audience. So again, for me, this is a really interesting quote in what is hopefully the next stage of the project. So we've got a number of hypotheses to test. So I want to bring the storytelling and the technology much closer together. So what we've been discussing, me and Richard and English Touring Theatre, is developing a writer's room. Not necessarily writers that have worked with XR before, but where there'll be an initial process of knowledge exchange, teaching them about augmented reality, about XR, and then from there we can start to develop our ideas. And then that process of developing the script, developing the work, will be a very close collaboration between my studio, Office of Everyone, and English Touring Theatre and their writers. So some things that I think we want to explore is the audience's role in the work. So at the moment, the piece that we created, it feels very voyeuristic, and we want to think about whether that is something we want to lean into. Is the audience a voyeur, or But equally, you know, we want to think about whether the audience can have control over the piece. Maybe there are a number of performances going on and it's more like promenade theatre. You can move between the pieces. You can interact with them in a different way. Also interested in whether people watching something together can induce that feeling of liveness, going back to Philip's quote here. And yeah, we're also interested in the context in which the work is seen. So one of the exciting things about publishing work through, you know, augmented work through ubiquitous devices like phones and tablets is that we have no control of where it's going to be viewed. So it could be viewed in a home, in a classroom, on a beach, anywhere. And so we want to think about, is that something we want to consider as we develop the work that's going to be shown through this medium? And does the piece want to interact with that lack of control with the context? Finally, just we're really interested in also in, you know, the possibilities with creative captioning. So as I said, Office of Everyone is you know, inherent, you know, really involved with improving access. And you know, something that hasn't been explored fully yet is creative captioning within AR. So it's been explored in theatre. There's some beautiful examples of it, but we want to really think about how creative captioning can be an inherent part of the narrative rather than an afterthought. Very briefly, finally, on English Touring Theatre. I think when I initially brought the project to English Touring Theatre, I hadn't realised what a perfect partner they'd end up being. But they've been going 29 years, 105 productions, 2 million audience members. But the key thing is English Touring Theatre, their remit for the past 29 years has been to take amazing theatre to places that otherwise wouldn't have access. They tour shows, amazing shows, to theatres in smaller locations, not just the obvious cities. So for me, what we're doing with Through the Cracks is continuing that legacy, but using digital technology. And that's everything from me. If anyone wants to reach out, has any more questions other than just today about the project, you can email me at my Royal College email address there, or I'm on Twitter. We're developing the studio website at the moment, so you won't find really anything about the project online yet, but in the coming, I think we're about 2 weeks off finishing the website, so there'll be some more info on the project then. But thank you very much.
Thank you, Joe.
How do I stop?
No, I mean, gorgeous work, and thank you for, you know, giving us that insight into it. And okay, looking at the questions, we've got a question from Emily asking if she wonders if you have or are planning to co-create projects with students. She knows you mentioned about testing, but how might you work with students and explore teaching as a part of your process?
Brilliant question. Thanks, Emily. Definitely. You know, I think it's fairly clear here that my interest with my studio and my interest in the research community, the storytelling community that I run on Digital Direction, are perfectly aligned. And I would like to think that this project, Through the Cracks, is a fairly good representation of what I really want the students to strive for. So definitely, I think there's a few opportunities for that. So the writer's room that I described, I've been talking to English Touring Theatre about the possibility of my students. So it's quite a big group I've got in my community. It's 29 students, but of the possibility of my students sitting in on a writer's room or hosting a writer's room or a reading room with the students and starting to delve into the script. Richard's just the most, watching his directing process is just magical. So that's one example. But, you know, if we think of the longer term, you know, the long term of this project, I love the idea of multiple stories being told in this format. And so, you know, looking longer term, I'd love to give the students the opportunity to kind of create stories for the project. But thank you for the question.
That's not a good look for somebody who's meant to be supporting the technology. Okay, thank you for that. But from my own perspective, I mean, I know that people are quite jaded with the whole discussion about pandemic and lockdown and things. But one of the things that I've noted is there was a huge shift as theatre companies looked at different ways of engaging and have taken on technologies that they wouldn't have traditionally used. I'd be interested to hear a little bit more about, you know, your experience of that and experience of your colleagues in other companies, but also to look at how it's shaking out now. is the interest that sort of emerged as a result of the lockdown within audiences, within practitioners, is that changing, or is it is it going to carry on that growth curve?
Yeah, brilliant question. So pre-pandemic, I was definitely banging on the doors of some theatre companies and saying, you really need to get serious with technology. And theatre has some pretty, hardcore hierarchies, and people have very set ways of doing things, which is why, the theatre companies that I've worked with some Big Telly in Northern Ireland, Raucous in Bristol, English Touring Theatre in London. For me, theatre companies that are willing to take enormous risks, I just think are incredible, because it's not an industry that is particularly excited about technology generally. But having said that, having banged on a lot of doors before the pandemic hit, and theatres, like many industries, were stuck in a situation where they didn't have an output anymore. And so that's where they started to look to technology to do some really exciting things. Now, I had hoped, and there are signs that it is the case, that would then continue beyond the pandemic or beyond lockdowns. I think there is now a big push to get people back into physical spaces, and it's also really exciting to be back in physical spaces. So like I say, projects like this for me are not a replacement for physical theatre, but I'd still see that there is still an interest in technology continuing. And I think that I would say that practically, I think there was not incredible amounts of funding. There was quite a bit of funding for digital projects over lockdown. There is less funding now. I personally have not had too bad an experience with that. The projects that I'm doing have continued. So I feel positive about things. But I think beyond theatre, I see on the horizon an XR storytelling boom. I mean, people would argue the boom's already in flow. But for me, I think if you think about mainstream AR, for example, people think of filters on Instagram, filters on Snapchat, silly stuff, that there's not often a large amount of storytelling. But we're looking now to a next phase of that, where big companies are going to be releasing all sorts of glasses and these technologies. And so I see an XR storytelling boom on the horizon. And for me, theatre writers, theatre creators can play a really exciting role in that, because I don't see many brilliant writers involved with XR yet. I think there are some beautiful example projects, don't get me wrong, amazing projects, but I think a lot of XR hasn't got brilliant writing behind it. And so I see that there's some exciting, and I see that there's a link there between theatre and XR. For example, particularly things like promenade theatre. If you think about these free roaming XR experiences and promenade theatre, for me, there's a closer link there between those two than potentially filmmakers and that. So yeah, I see that there's a potential boom happening. It might not be that we call it XR theatre. It might be that it's theatre involved in XR, but there's some exciting stuff I see on the horizon. Okay,
interesting, and that makes a lot of sense. Okay, we've got a question from Rob, who's asking about the role of audience. I think building on it kind of balances nicely with what Emily was asking. The role of audience in the work. Do you think their level of interactivity affects their sense of liveness, their presence? Which actually, I'd be interested if you could tell us a little bit more about the techniques you use on that, just to follow on from that question.
I think it's a brilliant question, so thank you. So interactivity is a really interesting thing in terms of immersion, because I would argue that I've sat in front of a film and been far more immersed in a film than linear media than a free roam XR experience, because I'm very aware. I've got a headset on. I'm very self-conscious about what other people can see of me. So but on the interaction thing as well, I think sometimes in XR interaction can feel a bit clunky. It can feel a little bit like, do you want to go this way or this way? So what I'm particularly interested in is more subtle interaction. So it's, for example, the idea of there being multiple performances happening under the floor and the audience having the choice to move between those performances. that is interaction for me. And we can build in clever stuff. So if the audience chose to look at performance 1 rather than performance 2 or 3, that could affect what's happening in the other spaces. So there are ways that you can build in fairly complex interaction, but they do not involve the audience saying yes or no, or clicking buttons. So some of the so I think that answered the first question, although I've forgotten it already. But to your question, Tom, some of the things that I'm particularly interested in, we're exploring. So back to the Philip Orslander quote about it being the experience of the audience. For me, I'm particularly interested in whether people viewing something as a group together as an audience can make something that is effectively linear media feel like a performance because of the way that they interact with one another. So that's one thing I'm really interested in exploring. The kind of interaction thing I'm also interested in exploring. And then right at the far end of things, the kind of far end of the spectrum would be the audience as performer. And there's been some really interesting work done on this, but the idea that maybe subtly the audience can be turned into part of the performance. Now, I think the project, some of those are pretty, weighty ambitions, but in aiming really, really high, even if we only get halfway, hopefully we'll get something really exciting.
Brilliant, thank you. And it makes me think of Johnny Freeman's research at Goldsmiths, looking at the experience, the impact of not being part of a co-located audience for theatre going, for theatre events. Okay, thank you for that, Jack, and thank you to Emily and to Briony. I think this has been a really interesting session. And if there aren't any more questions, we'll gently bring it to a conclusion a couple of minutes early. But just to say, as I've said before, everybody's available today. As I noted before, unfortunately, Lora Markova is unwell and couldn't present. However, she has talked at the live event, and the recordings of that they'll be coming live in the next few days on YouTube, and then later on the Beyond site. So I hope you've enjoyed as much as I have, and look forward to seeing you all again in the Meet the Researcher sessions later on this afternoon. Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Jack. Thank you, Emily. Thank you, Briony. Great session.